I was actually going to start by talking about taxes, but I just want to start by talking about education because, we're talking about it before, and it's something that's just so unbelievably important to our society. What I usually talk about education is the following fact, which is that June of the senior year in high school, our education system is struggling. And 3 months later, in September of the freshman year of college, all of a sudden we have the best college system in the world. So in 3 months, something magical happens. And some people say that we put more money into it, but if you look at the facts, we spend more per student than any country, except for there's a phrase Monaco or something like that. One very small country, but basically almost, and certainly more than Japan or China or Korea or India, we spend more per student. So it's not money. I think what it is, obviously, is competition. That the colleges compete with each other. My college had competition can lead to pretty big innovations. My college was Brown, and one of their innovations was that they were like, no more core curriculum. One of our big competitors, Columbia, decided to do the opposite. They said, we're going to take a small number of courses and make them as good as we possibly can. So in this direct competition between each other, not only do we get improvement, but we also got choice. That's something that you have in a competitive system. But that's actually not the part of education I want to talk about today. I want to talk about what's actually missing in our education system, the high school education system, and in our college education system. I was an econ major. I think we have a little competition today. That's fine. I was an econ major, and I was an actuary. So I've taken macroeconomics 3 times. I've taught macroeconomics about 5 or 6 times. I've taught game theory God knows how many times, and I've taught AP economics, which is macro and microeconomics, more times than I can begin to count. So the point is, I know a certain amount of economics. I worked as an actuary, and I studied economics there too. And in all that time studying economics, there's 2 names that I never heard. I never heard of the French economist Bastiat, and I never heard of Hayek. I just didn't know that they existed. It wasn't even that in the textbooks to say, here's this guy Bastiat, and here's why he's wrong, and here's why you shouldn't listen to him. It's just that they didn't mention it at all. And getting more in this liberty movement, there are people that we have mentioned in history. We've mentioned Thomas Jefferson. But there's certain writings and speeches of his where he talks about the dangers and problems of taxation, or the dangers and problems of a sort of loose banking and loose monetary policy. When he says that if we're forced to be taxed in our enjoyments and in our vice and our enjoyments and in our food and our drink, then we're going to basically end up working 16 hours a day and have to give 15 of those at the product of the labor, 15 of those hours to the government. And we're not going to have the time or the energy to begin to fight back against it. And the fact that I'd never heard that saying, now I took AP history, I studied some history in college, I've taught history at the middle school level, at the high school level, and I'd never heard these anti-tax just rants from Thomas Jefferson. Now, we can say that we disagree, but the fact that it's not there is unbelievably significant. So when I started looking at this, I thought to myself, well, if it's not there, who's taking it out? We don't live in a communist country. The government doesn't really directly censor our textbook. People talk about, Texas pressures textbook companies to do this and that, but there's no direct government censor that would just remove something like that from the curriculum. And as I thought about it, I said, well, who literally writes a textbook? Now, if it's an econ textbook, it's probably written by an econ professor. And if it's a history textbook, it's probably literally going to be written by a history professor. Whatever textbook it is going to be written by a professor of that subject. Now that sounds fine, because there are conservative professors and there are sort of liberal professors, but on average, professors, compared to other people at that level, tend to be a little bit more socialist leaning. Or if you go to a school like mine, I went to Brown, a lot more socialist leaning. Now that to me is troubling. The fact that our entire education is being sort of controlled and edited and censored by people who themselves live in kind of like a socialist environment. When you're a teacher, you're paid to teach. When you're a professor, you're not really paid to teach. You're paid by the university, and you have to do this thing, you have to do some other stuff, and you also have to teach. But it's not that kind of direct one-on-one thing that most of us do. If you work as a salesman at Best Buy, you're expected to sell something. That's what you're paid for. If you sell cars, you're paid a commission. So that then, to me, is one thing that's very troubling. And what's especially troubling about that is it's beginning to shape the sort of American populace, the mindset, especially in economics, of the American populace, in ways that are, I think, just flat out dangerous, and that they're biased, they're incomplete, there's facts that are not being shared. Classic example of this, we talk about taxation. Taxation, we say, taxation should be progressive, it shouldn't be regressive, blah, 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 blah. And, to a certain extent, I have a certain amount of sympathy for that, but not very much. But when you look at the actual facts of our tax code, who are some people that pay exceptionally low tax? I mean, some people are just poor, they pay lower tax. But who are the rich people that pay lower taxes? Anybody?
The ones that don't work.
The ones that don't work, and that's exactly right. People with inherited wealth, they don't pay income taxes because they don't have income. So if you inherit $1 million, producing essentially nothing, you get taxed less than somebody who works to produce that $1 million worth of output. And you don't get taxed a little bit less, you get taxed massively less. If you happen to be a drug dealer, or if you happen to be an illegal immigrant, you're off the grid. You pay massively lower taxes. If you get most of your income from investments, now there's two types of investment. There's economic investments, which is, if you're an artist, you buy yourself a paintbrush, or if you're a computer program, you buy a computer so that you can produce more. That to me is a great investment. Then there's a financial investment, which there's nothing wrong with, but it certainly doesn't add anything to anything. I mean, if you buy a stock and you make money, okay, great, but you didn't really produce anything. So the fact that people whose primary source of income is financial investments, they're also taxed less. Now, of course, we can say, well, why can't we increase the inheritance tax? Well, we could, but then we have a bit of a glitch, because what about a family farm? Now we're saying that each year the farm is going to get cut in half, and then by 5 years down the line, this 500-acre farm is going to be just about as big as so there are valid objections to that, which is one reason that I personally am really moved by this idea of a fair tax. And I'm just going to summarize it a little bit for those of you who don't know about it. A fair tax is basically a sales tax. It's a high sales tax, and it replaces income tax entirely. In order to make it not regressive, what we do is we essentially give people below a certain level of income almost like a voucher from the government for a certain amount. So we're not sort of taxing those lower down at a much higher percentage of their income. The advantages of the fair tax are, one, we don't have to deal with the IRS. We don't have to deal with the form. The compliance costs alone are $380 billion. And to put that in perspective, that's basically enough to pay for about 75% of all current college students' tuition for this year. Every year we could pay about 3/4 of America's college tuitions completely if we didn't have these compliance costs, which mean accounting costs and all the related paperwork costs, et cetera, and that doesn't even include the labor costs of filling the stuff out. I mean, that's aside from that, and if we include that, it probably gets a little bit higher, or it definitely gets a little bit higher. The other advantage of a fair tax is now, if you happen to be a Kennedy or if you happen to be a billionaire, you pay the same tax as everybody else, and I think that's fair. I don't think there's anything wrong with that whatsoever. In fact, I think that's how things should be. When you take the idea of taxation, one thing that's very closely linked to it, in terms of education, in terms of the general perspective, is, where are these taxes going?